Hey there, listeners. Galen here. This is the farewell to the 538 Politics podcast that we never actually got to record. I sat down to record it with Mary Radcliffe and Nathaniel Rakich a couple weeks ago, but it's been sitting in the vault because of all of the news that's been happening. But today is the day we're going to air it, so please enjoy. And we're back.
Wait, Galen, before we go too far, is this a family-friendly show?
No.
You can swear, absolutely, encouraged even, but I think for now I'm going to bleep it, and we'll see how we go. Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. On Tuesday, March 4th, President Trump was about an hour into his big address to Congress when I started getting text messages. Are you okay? I mean, I was kind of tired, a little bored, and not necessarily looking forward to recording a late-night podcast reacting to the address, but yeah, I was fine. And then the follow-up. Have you seen the Wall Street Journal article? Initially, I hadn't, but the article read, about 200 employees are being let go at Disney's ABC News Group and Disney Entertainment Network's unit, people familiar with the matter said, and continued, ABC is also eliminating the political and data-driven news site FiveThirtyEight, which had about 15 employees. After 9 years of making the 538 Politics podcast, it appeared my job was coming to an end. While the manner in which the news broke was surprising, if I'm being totally honest, the content of it was not altogether shocking. Inside of ABC, the first part of 2025 had felt like a layoffs waiting game, and the 538 site had already been winnowed considerably. Either way, though, what should I do with the news? I was sitting in my living room watching the address with our then producer on the podcast, Cameron Chertavian, and we were planning on recording a podcast with 538ers Nathaniel Rakich and Mary Radcliffe after the address was done. So had they seen the news? Should we still even record a podcast if our jobs were over? If we did record an episode, what should we say? In the end, we settled on the frontline soldier approach. Not to be too dramatic or anything. We knew that we were getting shot, but we had one last job to do. So we mostly stuck to the task at hand, assessing the address we just watched, though, again, to be completely honest, I basically stopped paying attention halfway through. And I obliquely mentioned the news about 538 shutting down at the top. The next morning, we got the official word, along with the word that all 538 editorial content would cease publishing immediately. That meant no farewell podcast or no farewell post on the site. That also means that there's an alternate universe podcast episode still out there. One in which Nathaniel, Mary, and I properly took the opportunity to put the podcast and the site to bed. Well, dear listeners, welcome to that alternate universe. Nathaniel Rakich, welcome to the GD Politics Podcast.
Hi, Galen. It's so good to be here.
Mary Radcliffe, welcome to the GD Politics Podcast.
Thank you, Galen.
It is my sincere pleasure to have both of you here. So, if you will, Nathaniel and Mary, step into my alternate universe machine and tell me, we'll start with you, Nathaniel. I should just say, for the record, that Nathaniel was still fully an employee of 538. Mary, you had left a little bit earlier in the year, but of course, you are still the politics data extraordinaire, so you were joining us for that episode, and I'm so glad we got to share that moment. Let's start with you, Nathaniel. What was your reaction when you saw the news the night of March 4th?
Yeah, it was very surreal because if people listened to that episode, you'll recall that I was at the State of the Union or the non-State of the Union in person. So I basically found out that I was out of a job sitting about 30 feet away from Donald Trump while he was in like minute 70 of this record long speech. So it was very, very strange. And I also found out people, actually, it was a friend of the podcast, Lakshya Jain, who texted me being like, hey, you okay? And I was like, I had this exact same reaction as you, Galen. I was like, Yeah, I'm good. I'm tired. I'm in the House chamber listening to Donald Trump. It's kind of going on a long time, but I'm good otherwise. Why? And then other people started texting me being like, "Hey, did you see the Wall Street Journal article?" And I was like, "Oh, no." And so I saw that and I was like, "Oh, okay." And so yeah, it was just a very weird out of body experience. I think that, yeah, obviously, again, longtime listeners / readers of 538 know that we went through a pretty brutal round of layoffs in 2023 where they cut over half the staff, including all of the sports team, a lot of the editors, and really just whittled it down. Yeah, science, and really just whittled it down to the politics team, which, yeah, at the time was 15, and then just because of departures, it ended up being only 12 by the time we all got laid off. But so 538 was not at its full strength, shall we say, but it was obviously still a sad moment. But it was nice to have a very weird subway ride home and then turn on my computer and see you guys and be able to talk with you and do one last podcast. But it's not actually one last podcast because we're here again, and it's so nice to see you guys.
We live to see another day. Mary, you had already made it out. You were free Mary Radcliffe, but you were getting ready to record a podcast with two people who had just found out they were being laid off. So what were you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I left a little earlier in the year was maybe a little prescient. I think there had been some semblance of seeing the writing on the wall for some of us in advance. Honestly, I was so glad to be able to join you guys on the podcast because I know a lot of us had been sort of preparing for this and having moved already to the other side. It was just nice to be there and be with you guys. I know it's a tough time for everyone, but I think we were maybe mentally prepared a little bit. Emotionally prepared is different. I don't know if I would go that far, but mentally prepared, I think everyone was there.
Beyond ourselves, right? We heard from a lot of people who told us what 538 meant to them in terms of understanding the world, in terms of understanding politics, appreciating evidence and rigor in trying to make sense of it all. And so we're going to talk about some other stuff here as well, present news. But while we're doing our farewell, to you, what did 538 set out to do? What did your work try to further?
I can't think of anywhere else on the internet that is as comprehensive with respect to the polling data as 538. Some folks may have seen some data that we are continuing to publish in just some Google Sheets for now. We'll see what happens with it. But the mindset of trying to take in everything and not being picky on the front end about the so-called quality of the poll and letting that shake out on the back end when you find out, hey, is this pollster any good? That sort of empiricism with respect to polling data, I don't know that we see that really anywhere else. I know there's other folks that aggregate data, but I think the methodological clarity and the comprehensiveness of that data set is so important to building a product that can be trusted, right? We cared a lot about the nonpartisanness of the data, not to say that all the polls are nonpartisan, but that we are equally partisan friendly. And I think that's really important. And that ethos is really the whole ethos behind what 538 tried to do in everything, right? The idea of let's look at everything we can so that we can shape a clearer picture of American politics and what the American people think and feel. I mean, I think that expansiveness is really the core, that openness to looking at all kinds of things and figuring out what the world looks like.
I don't think people know this, Mary, but you, along with our former colleague, Cooper Burton, were responsible for collecting the data that underpinned basically all the polling averages out there and much of the polling analysis on the market, spanning the New York Times, CNN, Silver Bulletin, and the likes. On top of that, behind the scenes, you had databases of polling on all kinds of questions going back years, on the economy, on abortion, on immigration. For any given topic, I could basically go to you and ask, what do Americans think about X and how has that changed over time? That is the expansiveness that you are talking about. And for those many years that I came to you asking, what do Americans think about this? Can we cook up a quick average on that? Thank you. But I just wanted to say that. Nathaniel, what does 538 mean to you?
My goals and hopes for 538 were just to make political analysis smarter in general and put things out into the world that obviously, we thought were correct. And I think there are a lot of people, some of our critics would be like, oh, well, like, you guys are like defending the polls because like, your like job relies on it or whatever. And like, sure, like that's true. But like, I work here at 538 because I believe that the polls are reliable. Like the causation runs the other way. And so I felt really passionate about using data and kind of empirical studies to be like, these are the things that there is evidence behind and that have been proven to be true or that we believe are true. And this is what we should be basing our predictions on or our analysis on, and putting that out into the world and helping people understand probabilities and margins of error and all those things. I think that was the goal of 538 from the very beginning when Nate started it, and he did such a good job of taking these somewhat wonky concepts and translating them into plain English. So as a result, I do think that 538 made the discourse smarter. There are always going to be people who go make election predictions based on vibes and are always going to misunderstand probabilities. But I think that we did the best we could to try to educate those people. But at the same time, I do think that without 538, there is a gap. I think all of the data we mentioned that we collected that is now gone or at least harder to access, I think that's a huge loss. I think about some of the journalism that we did kind of behind the scenes. So like, for instance, every time a new pollster came onto the scene, we would do our due diligence. Mary and Cooper and myself and Elliot Morris would vet the pollster and ask them questions. And I'm not sure there's anybody else out there doing that. And so I think the risk has increased that there'll be a new pollster on the block in 2026 that some people run with uncritically because there's nobody out there kind of vetting them the way that we did at 538. So I'm proud of what we did. I'm obviously sad that it is gone. I think that there are a few kind of worthy successors or heirs out there, but nothing, including this podcast. But
Well, thank you.
What we had was special, and it will never be truly recreated.
What about you, Galen?
Yeah.
Oh, good question, Mary. I guess for me, it meant a lot of things. I was there for 9 years, so it meant a lot of things personally, emotionally. I made lifelong friends there, and so I will miss that. But from an intellectual perspective, I think there are two things that I would say, which is, first and foremost, I understand people's skepticism sometimes about the polls and all, is it really people or is anyone responding? And the reality is that we have an alternative, and it's people like me going to a town in Pennsylvania in the run up to an election, walking down Main Street, talking to Susie, Beth, Stephanie, and Tim, and being like, okay, well, what do you think about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? And I take those 4 conversations and I write up an article or do a podcast and I say, okay, that's what people think about this election. The alternative is what we were doing, which is relying on the scientific method to try to get as close to a representative sample as we can of what public opinion is. It's imperfect, but it gets us a lot closer than the first instance that I mentioned. And we use the scientific method. We use sampling to try to answer all kinds of questions. Like when you get a blood test, they don't drain all the blood out of your body in order to figure out how healthy you are. They just take some of it and they do an analysis based on that portion of your blood. And that's what we were trying to do for the body politic, basically. And it was a worthy endeavor, and it's going to continue in many different forms. And so that's my defense of the sort of work that we did and why it matters. Yes, people are interested in elections and the horse race and the like, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Having good empirical information about the country is core to our democracy and making good decisions. I'll just cite this one example and then we can move on. Several years back, I was at a gay bar in Brooklyn, kind of hanging out, doing my own thing. And the chief of staff for a powerful politician in New York State, who happened to be a podcast listener, spotted me and started chatting with me and talking about politics and policy and whatnot. And what he was saying started to confuse me in terms of what I knew New York voters to actually feel or want or whatnot. And so I asked him, what percentage of New Yorkers do you think have a 4-year college degree? And you're like, well, I don't know, 65%?
I'm sorry.
Merrick's having a little heart attack over there.
The actual answer is 40%, and the national average is 38%. So New York is not that far off from the national average. But the fact that somebody who believes that 2/3 of New Yorkers have a 4-year college degree is helping make decisions that impact their lives is problematic, right? Because whether or not you have a 4-year college degree affects the kind of work you can do, how much you make, your perspective on a whole host of issues, your life experience, just to be blunt. And if you don't understand that kind of data about America, not only will you not make good decisions if you're working in the political sphere, not only will you not do a good job covering the country if you're in the journalistic sphere, but you also, if you're a business leader, won't make good business decisions about trying to serve the American public. And the list goes on and on and on. And so understanding who Americans are and what they believe is fundamental to good decision making.
Yeah. Amen.
Does that answer the question, Mary?
I think we all worked at 538 for years because we do believe that this is the best approach you have to understanding what people think.
It's not perfect, but nothing is. This is the best we got.
Mm-hmm.
I have one final question before we move on to some more recent polling stuff, which is, or comment, which is I started getting messages on Instagram primarily saying, oh, you know, I originally tuned in to 538 or started watching the podcast on YouTube because I thought Nathaniel was cute.
What?
And this was mostly...
So you're saying other people were like, hey, Galen, the host of the podcast,
Yep.
I didn't listen for you. I listened for this other guy.
And this was mostly coming from... you might
men
be
or
able to
women?
guess. Yes, men. So Nathaniel, would you like to clear the air once and for all about
Again, you're going to have to do this every day until the day you die, Nathaniel.
Oh my God. Look, I'm grateful for all of our fans, and I just want to say that thank you, and I will not be taking questions at this time.
Wait. Whoa.
Look, you want me to come out as straight on this podcast?
Again.
Look.
Yes. Several years ago on National Coming Out Day, the 538 Politics podcast came out as gay in a cold open with Nate Silver.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been done before. Nathaniel, what's your alphabet?
Listen, I'm very sorry to all of my listeners, my fans, but I don't swing that way. I don't know. I'm straight.
All right, with that,
sorry. I don't know.
let's talk about some recent polling, but first, a break. Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. I'm in the early stages of getting this podcast off the ground, and it will only succeed with your support. I want to bring you coverage that embraces curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. And I want to bring it to you on a regular basis with more episodes, more insight, and more laughs. I can only do that if you subscribe to and support this podcast. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. Even better, do it right now. gdpolitics.com, that's G as in gosh, D as in darn, and politics as in that hot mess. Head to gdpolitics.com to subscribe, and thank you. I have a game that I want to play with you all, if you'll indulge me, and stop me if you've heard of something similar before, but this game is called GD Needy. And it is spelled GDBDND, and that stands for good data, bad data, not data.
Okay.
I would just like to point out that there is ABC has not copyrighted the phrase "good or bad use of polling." We can use that phrase.
I don't want anyone coming after me. You know, okay, I gotta cover my bases. Also, GD. One more thing
That's
that
true. Oh
the
my
podcast
gosh.
could stand for: good data.
That's true.
Okay. This data comes courtesy of the Capital Weekly in California, which conducted a survey of 1,000 Californians on the topic of none other than Gavin Newsom's new podcast called This is Gavin Newsom. On that podcast, so far, he's talked to right-wing influencers like Charlie Kirk and Steve Bannon. More recently, I think now he's also talking to Democrats like Tim Walz, although I don't think that had happened by the time they conducted this survey. So on Twitter, Yashar Ali wrote up the findings from this survey as the following. New data on the reaction to Gavin Newsom's new podcast. Favorability amongst liberals has declined from 46 to 30%. While some Republicans agreed with his stances, they overwhelmingly viewed him as insincere, calling him fake and pandering. His net favorability dropped from +4 to -6, a 10-point swing in the wrong direction. Only 13% of voters had an improved perception of him, and only 1 in 5 said the podcast made them want to tune in for more. Okay, this got a decent amount of play online, with accounts like Gen Z New Yorker responding, quote, "Centrist Dems need to learn from this. Trying to pivot to the right never works. It just causes the people you're trying to win over to feel like you're fake and pandering." So let me ask you, is this GDBD or needy? Good data, bad data, or not data? Mary Radcliffe.
I think this is bad data.
Bad data. Okay. All right. Well, before you explain, Nathaniel, would you like to come down in one direction or another?
I think it's fine data. I think it's, it's interesting for what it is. I don't think it tells us like all that much because it's like specifically California voters who were shown podcast clips, most of whom saw them kind of in isolation. And as long as people don't overinterpret it, I think it's fine.
Okay. I think it's borderline not data. But Mary, okay, so we got a little bit of Nathaniel's rationale. What's your rationale for bad data, BD?
So, first of all, Nathaniel's totally right. This is a poll of Californians, not Americans. And I think Californians are different from Americans in a lot of fundamental ways, just like voters from any specific state are going to be different from the country as a whole in some fundamental ways. In addition, one of the first things they mention in the article writing up this poll, and I didn't see a full top line available from this poll, by the way. So
no, there was a write up. There was a write up of the emotional sentiment.
Yes,
the actual responses that included. One second, I just have to read this. Like quotes like, "Why do we need another podcast?"
Everyone's starting podcasts these days. What's up with that?
Another quote. "We don't need another podcast. We need a government dealing with the problems in California. Female over the age of 65. And finally, I don't listen to political podcasts, only murder ones. Male, 65 plus, white, $100,000 a year, Democrat." So
Galen, I have to interrupt this podcast. There's been a murder.
Like you were saying, they did provide a full rundown of all of the open-ended responses, but not a top line of the poll questions. But one of the poll questions they mentioned is that 0.057%
That's fun.
of the people they spoke to had listened to this podcast. Out of 1,000 people, like 0.057%. So we don't have reaction to Gavin Newsom's podcast among these voters. What we have is a reaction to the specific and particularly inflammatory clips that the pollster selected to show to these voters. I read the entire transcript of this interview with Charlie Kirk, and what the pieces that were picked out were the things that were intended to needle the kinds of culture war issues that get people all riled up. So when people are having these reactions to those clips and saying it makes them think less of Gavin Newsom, I mean, okay, but you're not really reacting to the podcast. This isn't an organic reaction to what it would be like if people actually listened to the whole podcast. Now, maybe you could do a poll of that. I don't know. But I just don't think that this data is actually capturing the way people would react if they were experiencing this media like in full.
It's like if we just clipped the portion of this podcast where I asked Nathaniel if he was gay.
Yeah, and people would probably say mean things about you, Galen.
No, but like that's the point, right? Is that like nobody's going to listen to this podcast. Nobody. Like I think that is one of the 0.057%. That's one of the most illuminating numbers from this poll. But like people might hear about it on social, they might see clips on social media and they might hear about it through like headlines because the write-up was correct that like, things like Gavin Newsom saying that it's unfair that transgender women be on girls sports teams, like that did get a lot of headlines. And that is what people are seeing about this stuff. They're not listening to the whole podcast. So I think that is fine. And again, I think as long, like, I don't think Gavin Newsom's popularity is going to be significantly affected by this podcast. But if a narrative comes across that like, oh, he's talking to Charlie Kirk, he is, taking these moderate stances on these culture war issues, that creates a brand around him that he could take in 2028 that would be relevant, if not dispositive to the outcome and kind of which quote unquote lane he's in.
Yeah, and I guess to your point about favorability, it depends, like, favorability with whom? This polls of California voters, and like, is it possible that some of the more moderate or centrist positions that Gavin Newsom took in that conversation with Charlie Kirk might turn off California voters in particular? Possible. I don't know that we know how the American electorate at large thinks about that.
Well, one of my issues with this whole exercise that Capital Weekly did here is I don't know if how much of this is even really a poll. So what they did was they showed 3 different clips from that Charlie Kirk interview, and they included an introduction where, Gavin Newsom makes a joke about his kid wanting to stay home from school to, meet Charlie Kirk or whatever, and then Charlie Kirk responding like, you shut the schools down for long enough, what's one more day? That was the first clip. The next clip was about woke culture and using terms Latinx and pronouns. And then the third clip was the one about trans women in women's sports, and the quote that you already mentioned, Nathaniel, where Newsom calls it deeply unfair for people who were born male to be participating in female sports. So those are the 3 clips. And then they collect all of the responses, an open-ended response, and then they go and code them as positive, negative, or neutral. They don't do an actual poll of like, after this clip, do you have a positive, negative, neutral view of Gavin Newsom? It's kind of like going through a rigmarole to get there.
Sort of. I mean, it's kind of like, it's a kind of a blend of a poll and a focus group. Like they did ask some questions like, what do you think about transgender women in girls sports? And like they asked a favorability question. I agree. I would have liked to have seen a list of all the questions or like, in a full kind of top line. So we knew exactly like what order things were asked in, for instance. But like, there were like overall numbers for his favorability rating and stuff like that. But then, yeah, the open-ended responses are kind of like a focus group, which like I think is data. Like I think it's a novel use of, like, you couldn't do a survey like this in 20 years ago right over the phone, right? This is the type of survey that you could only do online by showing people these clips, and like it gives you an opportunity to get insight that you might not have gotten otherwise. So like again, I think as long as you are kind of take things with a grain of salt, I think it's interesting.
Okay, what insight are we even getting here? Because the final clip that they showed, which was the one about transgender participation in sports, the sentiment analysis in the responses ranked 63% negative, 16% neutral, and 20% positive, right? That's the sentiment analysis. But like you said, they also conducted a poll where they asked, how do you feel about trans women participating in women's sports? And only 13% said yes, trans women should participate in women's sports. 61% said no, and 26% said it depended on the situation. So basically, we have here that Californians do not think broadly that trans women should be participating in women's sports, but that overwhelmingly there was a negative response to Gavin Newsom taking that position on the podcast.
Well, but there's a lot of reasons that you might feel negative about that, even if you agree with what that person is saying. For example, you might feel like they're flip-flopping on a position that they had previously held, or you might think they're being disingenuous and that they're saying the 80 side of the 80-20 issue, as Charlie Kirk called it in the podcast, to score some cheap political points or something like that. So agreeing isn't the only thing people need in order to like a person or like the way they talk about something.
Right. And this is where the focus group aspect of it comes in, because if you had just asked people, watch this clip and tell me if you had a favorable or an unfavorable reaction to it, you would get that mostly unfavorable reaction. And then that could be misinterpreted because you'd be like, oh, but like this doesn't agree with that other thing that shows that people actually don't want transgender women participating in girl sports. But like the focus group respondents basically were like, the Democrats didn't like it because, they were more pro transgender rights. Republicans didn't like it because they thought that Gavin Newsom is like a sleazy, flip-floppy, like liar.
Well, even Democrats thought that. I mean, the quote they pulled for the article from a respondent was, he's trying to split from the party to position himself for a presidential run. And that was from a Democrat.
And so this is why I think like this is a kernel I think you can take out of this, which is that like Gavin Newsom is not good at this, and he comes across very inauthentically, and I think that will be a problem for him if he runs for president.
I think it's always been a problem for him.
Yeah.
Okay. Hold our horses here. So it looks like if you read what was posted on Twitter, it looks like, Gavin Newsom's favorability declined as a direct result of having this podcast. And that's not the case.
And that's obviously.
You could also just do a poll, not trying to tie this all into the podcast, and see how Californians feel about Gavin Newsom. And when you do that, so Public Policy Institute of California just released their first survey of 2025, and they found that Gavin Newsom's popularity is on the upswing. Majorities of California adults, 52%, said they approve of the way that Gavin Newsom is handling his job as California governor. And that is up from 44% last October. Now, of course, data can tell us
how many disapprove.
The disapproval number is 47% of adults disapproved.
I mean, that's a pretty bad approval rating, I would think, for such a strongly partisan state to only be a positive 5.
Absolutely the case. But they don't find that the general trend is downward for Newsom, at the very least. And what they, some of what they cite here are the wildfires in Los Angeles, it being...
Which I'm sure a lot more people heard about than the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that this sentiment analysis is on a mission to make it look like Gavin Newsom is an idiot for doing what he's doing. But tell me if you disagree.
I don't disagree, right? Like I said, I read the whole transcript, and I actually think there is some really interesting and substantive conversations about how the two parties present themselves to the American public between Newsom and Charlie Kirk that were much more interesting to me than this culture war stuff.
Yeah, and I think maybe this gets us back to the broader conversation, which is Gavin Newsom doing something that is electorally advantageous, if that even is his goal? We'll see. There's also some murmurs that they cite in this write-up about what he really wants to do is start a media empire and not run for president in 2028. Who really knows? But if the goal was to get more Americans to support you or your party or whatever, is this the way that you do it?
If we knew the answer to that, then... or if Democrats knew the answer to that, if Republicans knew the answer to that, they'd win all the elections.
I don't think it is the right thing to do. I wouldn't base that entirely on this, analysis. But I think we just have to take a big picture and zoom out. And so I think the first thing we need to say is the presidential election is in 3 years and 10 months. We have no idea what the issues are going to be. We have no idea whether the vibes are going to shift in a more liberal direction like it was during the 2020 Democratic primary, or if we're still going to be in kind of this conservative zeitgeist. We have no idea. I don't really think that Gavin Newsom's theory of the case is a good one now, but maybe he'll be right and I'll be wrong. But I think fundamentally, taking a step back, right, is that most people are not strongly concerned with culture war issues like transgender people playing sports. The polls continue to tell us what they told us in the election last year, which is that the big issues are the economy, immigration, and democracy. If you look at Quinnipiac, that just came up with a recent poll. 30% of Americans thought that the economy was the most urgent issue. That was actually up a little bit, and perceptions of the economy were down since Quinnipiac's last survey. You have preserving democracy at 25%, and that's up. And I think that a lot of the Elon Musk, Doge stuff, and kind of Trump's executive power grabs feed into that as well. And immigration is at number 3 at 12%, and that's down a little bit since the election. And I think that fundamentally, Democrats have one big weakness, which is immigration, an issue that people still care about and that Democrats are on the wrong side of public opinion on. But the economy, the nice thing about that for Democrats is that they ain't in charge anymore. And the longer this goes on, and if people continue to be unhappy with the economy, it's Donald Trump's economy. And I think the advantage on that flips to Democrats. And you already saw in the Quinnipiac poll, which had Trump at a pretty negative approval rating overall, it also had him negative on the economy. And so I think that the thing for a smart Democrat to do is basically just be like, Donald Trump is doing a bad job with like Americans, like pocketbook issues, and also all this Elon Musk stuff is crazy, isn't it? And that's the winning message right now, with the big caveat that I don't know what it'll be in 2027 when Gretchen Whitmer is knocking on doors in New Hampshire in the snow. But that's kind of my general take.
Yeah, and I think I'm sure our listeners, the kind of folks that are listening to the GD Politics podcast, are tuned in to some of the conversations that are being had among Democrats, among analysts about the Democratic Party right now. I mean, I think there's a sort of spaghetti at the wall approach to try to figure out what direction the party's going to take. And if Gavin Newsom wants to throw this particular piece of spaghetti, might stick.
Yeah. I mean, I think obviously Democrats face some pretty hefty perception problems. And I think that part of it is policy. And obviously, the two of us have spent a lot of time talking about the issues on which Democrats are on the wrong side of public opinion. But people also form their views of a party and politicians around other things, like, do I perceive you as strong or weak? So, for example, more moderate, more bipartisan approaches oftentimes get majority public support. But if in the process of pursuing those things, you always come across as weak or a wet blanket or whatever, that's probably not good for your brand in an environment where people feel like the world is out of control on the economy, on immigration, on foreign policy and conflicts. And sometimes they also want somebody who is strong. And so, this came up in shutdown arguments and all of that, which is like, you have to think not just about the positions you're taking, but also the message you're sending people about who you are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I mean, Gavin Newsom seems to be sending a message that he's maybe more moderate than people think he is, maybe that he's willing to have hard conversations. Like that's, I think, part of this is the willingness to talk to all kinds of people. But I don't know that that's necessarily emblematic of the party and the party's choice of direction. Right now, the party hasn't really figured out what they're doing or where they're going.
Yeah, they don't have a single leader or unified message.
And they won't for a
to
while.
Their benefit for now in the midterms. Eventually they'll have to figure that out. But
yeah, but they're not going to for a while, and that people are going to have to just live in that soup of uncertainty. Exactly. I'm so sorry.
Yep.
And where the debate lands, like you're all saying, is super important. If the next election is waged over trans issues, Democrats would probably lose. I mean, obviously Republicans can go so far in one direction that they create a sympathetic backlash. Like, the median position in America is not be super disrespectful to trans people. It's we want trans people to be able to live their lives as they wish. This is literally how the polling question gets asked. But we also don't think X and Y things. So gender surgeries for minors or trans women in women's sports. But it's not like, let's be an asshole to Sarah McBride in Congress. Like, that's not the median position in America. And when you take something and run too far with it, you create your own kind of backlash sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I will be really, how exhausting would it be if we were fighting the 2028 election about trans issues again?
I have a feeling we won't, because I don't think we fought the 2024 election over it either.
No.
But, okay. With that, thank you, Mary and Nathaniel.
Thanks for letting us come on and talk polls.
Thank you, Galen.
It was absolutely my pleasure. My name is Galen Druk. We are still in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts. Also, importantly, subscribe to the Substack at gdpolitics.com. There you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support this project directly. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.